Good evening. Thank you for joining me tonight. Do you all have the outline for tonight? I'm not going to go over everything, but I try to list all the important dates, even some small events, like when the first time that the Zionism term was coined. It was only 1885. Do you know what Zion means? It's another name for Jerusalem, or sometimes Israel. Yeah. So that's Zion, or in Hebrew it sounds completely different. It's Zion. It's one of these words that doesn't really sound the same in English and Hebrew. So Zion, this TS or TZ sound, Zion is another name for Jerusalem, or Zion in English, and therefore Zionism is the desire of the Jewish people to go back to their ancestral land, and later on, since the 1880s, to establish or re-establish a Jewish state in the land that at that time was called Palestine. It has been called Palestine for almost 2,000 years at that point. We mentioned how it happened. The second day that I mentioned here, it's not a well-known fact, but it's interesting to see about the first anti-Zionist Arab newspaper. Because I try to emphasize all the time the idea that there is no inherent conflict or animosity between Jews and Muslims or between Jews and Arabs. It all started around that time over Zionism, over the desire of two peoples to establish a national country, a national land in the same place, in Palestine. So before 1908, really, there was no inherent tension. And I mentioned many times that for Jews throughout history, it was much better to live under Muslim regimes than under Christian regimes. For the most part, the Jews were called the protected people under the Muslims. They were not equal citizens, but there weren't so many persecutions, forced conversion, and large-scale massacres of Jews. Yes? Okay, thank you for this question. So from the very beginning, I try to follow the different names. So at the very beginning, Israel was named only of the northern kingdom. And then we had the southern kingdom, both Jewish states, if you want. The north was called Israel, the south was called Judah or Judea, the same thing. But many years ago, at 722, Israel disappeared. And what was left was Judea. Therefore, we are Jews. Okay, Jews are the descendants of Judea. We're not Israelites anymore. No more Israelites. Israel is what is known as the lost tribes. They disappeared. Okay, so until more or less the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132, the place was known as Judea or Judah. And then when the Romans were really angry with the Jews, they changed the name from Judea to Palestine. Why Palestine? The land of the Philistines. They wanted to erase the connection between the Jewish people and the land. Because when you hear Jews and Judah, it's the same thing, right? Americans in America sound the same. But Jews and Palestine have nothing to do. So by naming that land, I refrain from saying very, or the exact land, because the borders have always been shifting a little. But naming Judea Palestina or Palestine, they wanted to sever this connection of the people from the land. It didn't really work because part of being Jewish was always to maintain an affinity, a strong connection to the land. So you can call it Palestina. Please take the handouts and join us. No matter what we called it, Jews 3 times a day were praying God, begging God to restore them back to their land. But that's why. So it's the same, more or less, territory, but their borders have been shifting. Still today, Israel does not have a nationally recognized borders. It's one of the only countries in the world where there is a dispute where Israel starts and begins. When we're talking about the border with the West Bank or the Green Line, right? Israel claims that it's there, but okay, so the borders are a little bit tricky, but more or less that's what we are talking about. There was no Israel. Nobody used the name Israel until 1948. My grandparents who lived there, at least some of them emigrated to Israel in the 1930s. They moved from Vilna to Palestina. Okay, nobody used the name Israel. They knew that once they gained independence, they will call it Israel, but they didn't use it. Okay? So it's very confusing because today Palestine means something completely different. And it's when I'm talking about the Palestinians, Jews versus the Palestinian Arabs, I even got some comments from people who follow our class on Zoom. So what are they talking about? But this is the accurate way to call it. Okay? And you'll see why it's even more confusing as we will continue today. So far, so good? Now, in this group, I don't need to convince anyone to support Israel. Okay? I'm preaching to the choir, and so I don't try too hard to make you lovers of Israel. Today, or at least in the first part of this class, I would like to encourage you to try to put yourself in the shoes of the Arabs who lived in Palestine at that point. Because if we really want to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we must try at least to look at it from both sides. Most of us cannot. I really cannot, because I'm not only Jewish, I'm also Israeli. So I do the best I can to study the conflict from a Palestinian perspective. Okay, I don't think I'm betraying Israel or anyone by doing it. I just feel that I can understand the nuances a little bit better. And it's true for any conflict, because if you learn only about one side of any conflict, and that's what we do, we all read the same papers and watch the same TVs, and the other ones are all stupid and wrong, right? This is our, no, but if we try to keep an open mind and look at each and every important issue from both sides, we will gain a much broader understanding. I want to tell you a little bit the beginning of the story from an Arab perspective. That's the history of the place. And the first event let's go to the Great War, the First World War. In this war, the British and the French, but for now we'll focus on the British, knew that the end of the war should be the dismembering of the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was huge. And they knew that they were going to defeat the Ottomans, the Turks, and they are going to occupy a large part of this empire's territory. In order to defeat the Ottoman Empire, or one of the things that they did was to go to the Arabs who lives in the Ottoman Empire. And they knew that the Arabs there, may be a good group with which to collaborate. Before I continue with this story, I want to clarify another important things. Not all Arabs are Muslims, and not all Muslims are Arabs. Okay, for example, in Israel, 20% of the populations are Arabs, 90% of them are Muslims, but 10% are Christians. So there are Arabs of different religions and ethnic groups. Okay, so when we say Arabs, most of them are Muslims, but not necessarily. But there are many Muslims who are not Arabs. The largest Muslim country in the world is not Arab at all. Indonesia. And the second? Pakistan. Okay, they're not Arabs at all, and they're Muslim. Okay, it's important to remember it. In some places, and I cannot talk, I don't know much about Indonesia and Pakistan, but I know in some places like Turkey, like Iran, very Muslim countries, they tend to look down at the Arabs. They see themselves as a higher class people. They're not just the Arabs, the nomads from the desert. They are descendants of large civilizations. Okay, so if you tell an Iranian today, Arab, that, I mean, he will hate you just for being a Jew, but if you add to that, just call them Arabs, they will be offended. That was true for the Ottoman empires, for the Turks. Even though they shared more or less the same religion, they did not share the same ethnicity. And they recognized their ethnicity as better, as more sophisticated. So even though during the revolution in Turkey, 1908, that promised equality to everyone, everyone except of the Arabs. So the Arabs in the Ottoman empires always felt like they are discriminated against because they were. Okay, so they were a nice group for the Brits to collaborate with. More than that, I mentioned it more than once, many different groups in the world developed these nationalistic desires and aspirations. They wanted to have their own countries. And many countries were founded around that time in the world, right? So even mentioned not in the Middle East, but the Irish, the Indians, okay, they wanted to have their own countries. They didn't want to be controlled by anyone else. It was the same for the Arabs. Now I'm saying Arabs, that's one of the problems of the Arabs and everyone else. It's a huge group, extremely diverse. So we cannot talk about the Arabs like the Arabs, and they all think the same. But for now, we'll just use the word Arab. So they too had their nationalistic aspirations. They wanted to have an Arab country. Most of the Arab places that you know today, some of them were created artificially later, but they were under the Ottoman control. They wanted independence. Okay, so they felt mistreated by the Ottomans. They felt that they had these national aspirations. When the Brits approached them, they said, we want you, the Arabs, who are a large part of the Ottoman Empire, to rebel against the Turks. Join us. Okay, become the fifth wheel, call it whatever, the enemy from within. Use all the imagery that you have to describe it. And they were quite happy, the Arabs, to collaborate with the Brits, not only because of the hard feelings they had, but also because the Brits promised them something huge. What the Brits promised them was a huge Arab countries on most of the territory of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so instead of having the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, most of it will be some huge, unified Arab country. That's a dream. Okay, that's a huge dream. And the main leader, as you can see here, was the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, and he was happy to collaborate with the Brits. And indeed, there was an Arab revolt against the Ottoman empires during the First World War, which helped quite a lot to the Brits to defeat the Turks or the Ottomans, okay? So there was this nice collaboration between the Arabs of the Ottoman Empire and the British promised a lot for that. So far, so good? And you can see that was around 1915, 1916. The Arabs delivered. At the same time, the Brits also had a secret agreement, this time not with the Arabs, but with the French, that completely negated the promise they made to the Arabs. And that's known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. I just have the map I promised you last week. Don't try too hard, you cannot see anything, even if you see it like that. I'll give you another map that is clearer. But I wanted to look at this map because basically somebody really took a ruler and started to draw some things in it. This map, or the Sykes-Picot, which were two diplomats, Sykes was the Brit and Picot was the French, decided how to divide the Ottoman Empire between these two countries. So they just had this plan. And Russia had a little bit to do. More or less, the plan was that the French will get, let's go to the next one, which is a little bit easier. Do you see my cursor? Oh, I need to do that. The French will get Syria. You see Syria? They will get, I don't have Lebanon here, but I know the map, so they will get Lebanon. These are the French, more or less. The British will get Iraq. And in the beginning, Palestine, this is the important part, was supposed to be an internationally controlled area. Nobody owns Palestine, okay? They will change it a little bit later on and the Brits will control it. So to our purpose, the Brits and the French divided the leftovers of the Ottoman Empire between themselves. And what did the Arabs get? Nothing, okay? They felt huge resentment. They felt betrayed. Okay, this has nothing to do, or it has a little bit to do with the Jews, but mostly they felt betrayed by the British. Okay, we were promised a huge country, an Arab country, and we got nothing. To add to that, last week we ended with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. It's important to remember, we're all talking about a very short time, between 1915 and 1917, all these things happen. So the Arabs were still waiting to get their Arab countries from the British, and it was very clear that the British occupied this land and they won the war. And then what did the British do? Came up with the Balfour Declaration, which says that the British support the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Palestine was supposed to be part of the big Arab land that the British promised the Arabs. Okay? So not only that they didn't get their big land as promised, now the Jews, these annoying people who start coming to our land, are getting something while we're getting nothing. Okay? So again, I emphasize it and I try to to bring us to look at the conflict from, there is no conflict with us, but situation from the Arabs' perspective. They asked us to help, we fought the Turks, we won, we didn't get anything. Apparently the French and the British lied to us all along. There was never any real intention to give us anything. They just took advantage of us, and instead of giving us, they are giving things to the Jews. Okay? Interesting stuff. Now, at the aftermath of that, the British and the French did create some, instead of one large Arab state, they created many new Arab states. I have a little list here just to show you. Okay, so the first one was North Yemen, and then Egypt. Egypt was there before, controlled mostly or semi-controlled by the Brits, even after 1922. They gave King Faisal a new land, called it Iraq. Now, what they did with Iraq for a reason, there was no Iraq the way we know it today. They went to the same map and just took three major areas that used to be separate. They took Basra, they took Baghdad, and just and another, Basra, Baghdad, and forgot. The third one put a border, an artificial, almost arbitrary border. Oh, this is Iraq. King Faisal, happy birthday. You're now the king of that region, okay? The same with Lebanon. Okay, this is now New Lebanon. Took few major cities, Lebanon. Transjordan, which is Jordan, completely a made-up state. There was never Jordan. But King Abdullah I was a popular person amongst the Brits. Took a ruler, whoops, this is yours, King Abdullah, this is Jordan. Syria, why do you think there is such a mess in Syria all the time? The same thing. They just carved something, drew something, and this is Syria. And I did not include it here, but I just wanted to show you, they didn't even care about different religious groups, different affinity national groups. So let's just look at Iraq after Sykes-Picot, after the implementation of this, of the agreement of the British and the French. So Iraq is made of Shia Arabs, about 60%, and about 30% are Sunni. Shia and Sunni, as a rule, but not always, don't like each other, to put it extremely mildly. They collaborate today in our time when they have to attack Israel. But if they don't have Israel, for the most part, they have no reason to collaborate. They hate each other since after the death of Muhammad. And they have the Kurds. The Kurds is so about 15 to 20% of Syria are Kurds, completely different group that have big part of them are in Syria, they are in Turkey, in other places. Okay, so this is the new country. No wonder that Iraq never had some stability, except of sometimes with a dictator, until this dictator like Saddam Hussein was assassinated. Okay, Syria is very close to Israel. So Syria has a majority, 75% of Sunni Arabs. But the Sunnis did not get Syria. Syria was given to the Alawites. Alawites is a subgroup of Shia Muslims, and they are only 12% of the population, but they control Syria. Okay? Everything comes from this Sykes-Picot agreement, from what I showed. Look at this map. This is the awful, infamous map that was drawn around 1915-16, and still is the cause of all the mess in the Middle East in 2025. Okay, so these 12% Alawites, subgroup of the Shiites control Syria. Lebanon. Lebanon has three groups. They have Shia, which is the majority, but they are the poorest people. We have the Sunni in the middle, but the smallest group in Lebanon that was controlled, by the way, by the French. So in Lebanon, most people speak French, not just Arabic. The smallest group is the Christians. They are the wealthiest, and the president of Lebanon, by the constitution, must be Christian. Try to imagine, Lebanon is hardly functioning today. It has been on the verge of bankruptcy for a few years. I have no idea how they buy oil and food. Okay? So things probably might have been much better, at least less complex, without this agreement, the Sykes-Picot agreement of arbitrary division of the area between the influence of the British and the influence of the French. Any comments? Any questions? Yes, David.
What's the meaning of Iraq? Is it a translation of Iraq? English?
The meaning of Iraq, that's the name they call it. I don't know what's the etymology of the name Iraq. In the Bible, most of this land was known as Mesopotamia, or that's the ancient word of this land. But it's always a tricky thing to use ancient names to modern countries because the borders are not the same. But Iraq of today, I don't know why it's called Iraq. I never asked myself this question. I should have probably.
Does history bear out that in fact the French and the British were lying to the Arabs, or was there another way of thinking?
Thank you, Audrey. So Audrey, I was asked, and this is the main criticism I'm getting, and I apologize if I forget, but I'll try to remember all the time to repeat the questions, because people on Zoom are quite frustrated when I start talking about something and they don't know the question. Rightly so. So Audrey was asking, is there another explanation to the one that I shared with you, that the British just lied to the Arabs? There is another one. I'm less convinced that it's true, and this is that the Arabs had so many conflicts among themselves that they couldn't get their act together. It's absolutely true that it's even today when you look at the Palestinians, right? You have the Gaza and you have the West Bank. Most of the countries that you look at, there are different groups. Israel won the War of Independence in 1948 because the Arabs could not get themselves to unite and to fight together, because there are always these internal conflicts between different groups, different religions, different families. The family is a very important part, or as they call it, the Hamula, the large family, which is almost a tribe, a clan. Okay, it's really important. So your loyalty goes first to your clan and only then to your country. Okay, it's all true, but the documents that I read, I think more or less indicate that the British never had an intention to create this large unified Arab country. Probably they didn't even believe that they could do it, that the Arabs have it, even if they wanted, but they won. You know, they won a war. They wanted to win the war and to enjoy the spoil, at least for a while. So why giving all these wonderful things? Okay, so they created these different states and gave them to those who were loyal to them, expecting many things in return. But there's another theory. Thank you for this important question. Any other?
So my question is about the Jews that were there in those territories that all got divided up. And is that the reason why there was populations of Syrian Jews and Persian Jews and Egyptian Jews? I had friends that were all originally, they spoke French, the mom was Syrian, the dad was Egyptian. other religions, Shiism, were there just those little pockets of Jews? And
There were little or not so little pockets of Jews in Arab countries since Greek times. One of the largest Jewish communities was in Egypt, in Alexandria. The most amazing archive of Jewish books is the Cairo Geniza. It's the Cairo depository of old books that Schechter found, I think, in the 50s or the 1950s or 60s. Okay, so since then we had Philo, one of the important Jewish philosophers known as Philo from Alexandria. And so that was the first major Jewish community outside of Judea or Judaism. And then with each exile, Jews spread all over, and many of them lived in Arab countries. And Maimonides immigrated to Cairo because it was better to be in Cairo than to be in Spain, where he was persecuted by the Catholics there. Okay? Now, when there was imperial influence on the Arab countries, because they did not gain their independence, some of them until the 1960s, like Algeria, right, and Libya. So Italy controlled Libya. Jews from Libya speak Italian and Arabic. Jews from Morocco speak French, fluent French, and some Arabic, okay? So that's why French is quite common because they controlled North Africa, and the language, not Libya, but the language of many of them, Algeria, Morocco, etc., is French. When they develop their own communities, and as many communities tend to do, they feel like they are better than the others. So Syrian Jews, by the way, most of these Jewish communities were forced to leave the Arab countries after 1948, after Israel's independence. Okay, so there was a major expulsion, we'll talk about it, of Jews who lived for more than 2,000 years in the case of Egypt in that country, but after 1948, they were forced to leave. Okay, and some of them arrived in the US. So there are some groups of Persian Jews, I know in LA, in Great Neck, Long Island, Syrian Jews. I used to go buy some meat in Brooklyn, and they all think that they're better than others. Probably they are in some ways better than others, and at least a generation or two ago, for a Syrian Jew to marry an Ashkenazi Jew was 100% considered interfaith marriage. Not even Ashkenazi Jew, even another Sephardic Jew who is not Syrian. Okay, and we talked about the others, and okay, but that's you see everywhere. And what I mentioned before, even in this country, when the Eastern European Jews came to New York, or other places, but especially to New York, the German Jews who arrived earlier were super sophisticated by then. They helped them, but they would not allow them to go to their clubs. When I lived before, Sag Harbor, it's in the eastern Long Island, had 2 cemeteries, because the first one was founded by Austrian Jews, the blue blood of the Jews, and when the first Eastern European schlepper died, not in our cemetery, and so they bought the adjacent land. So even today, part of it is owned by the synagogue, and part of it is owned by the funeral home. So it's a whole, but I love these little stories because they really show you the mindset of the community. So all communities are the same when it comes to that. You know, our group is better than, right? My parents, I shared it, still fight whose Yiddish is higher class Yiddish. So this is not interfaith. This is, I mean, sort of, this is from Lithuania versus Lodz, which Poland. So, okay, so my mother thinks that she's a real aristocracy because her Yiddish is pure. But yeah, but that's what, and as a kid, oh, the Jews from Vilna are so much better than the Jews from Lodz. I didn't know where Vilna or Lodz was on the map. I learned since, but the Vilna, I was so proud to be a descendant of the Vilna people.
the Syrian Jews that I knew all had the last name Nasser.
All had what? I killed.
The same last name Nasser, which was the last name of an Arab Christian. And I just thought that's kind of interesting that it's the same surname that was for a Christian that it was Jews.
I know many Jews with last names of Smith here in America and Williams. And I knew Jews with Arab first names like Abdullah. Today it sounds like unheard of, okay? But right, Obama got a lot of flack for having a second middle name Hussein because, but yeah, people use different names and today they're associated with different things. So yeah, many Jews had similar names and sometimes try to distance themselves from the more common Muslim ones. Yeah.
Would you speak about Turkey and how they wound up having their own country despite being on the losing end of the First World War?
I'll just mention it very briefly because I want to continue with the Jewish history. They were left with only Turkey. So before that, if we're talking about the Ottoman Empire, right, they were stripped of the vast majority of that. Nobody wanted Turkey. They wanted the Turks to own Turkey. But all the other land that the Ottoman, the empire controlled for 400 years, including Palestine, okay, that's what they lost. So they were happy, the British and everyone else, you keep your own place, that's okay. You lost the war, you lost all the other territories. But that happened to all the other empires. Think about the British Empire, the French, think about even if you go to the Roman Empire. You know, London will always be British, but they lost so many other lands, or gave, whatever perspective you choose. Okay, I want us to move a little bit. So we understood, or at least I hope I clarify part of the Arab frustrations with the world, right? These people hate us, they promised, they didn't deliver, and they are nicer to the Jews. I have another table here. I want to show you another reason for the Arabs to be alarmed. So let's look at the number of Jews in Palestine. I started more or less with the beginning of the Zionist movement. As you can see, 1880, there are only 5% Jewish. Okay, so about 500,000 Arabs and 25,000 Jews. A tiny, tiny group, okay? And then if you look, they are growing. You see this anomaly in 1918? Any ideas why? How come now there are less Jews, or about the same, less Jews in Palestine than there were before, if there is a constant increase? During the war, again, the Great War, who controlled Palestine? The Turkish, the Ottomans. They identified the Jews as a potential enemy. So they deported some Jews, like the Jews from Tel Aviv. They deported them out or restricted their movements, and many Jews tried to get out of Palestine during the war because they were targeted by the Turks. Okay, so that's why, that's one main reason that you see this decline. And of course, it was a war, and the conditions there were quite awful, even worse than in many other places. So Jews in Palestine did what people try always to do, to escape difficult places, especially when they are personally targeted, and to go to slightly better places. But after that, you see the constant growth of Jews, 8.5%, then 11%, 16%, 28%, and look at 1939, right, the beginning of the Holocaust, more or less, the Jews are now about a third. Okay, so again, try to envision yourself, imagine yourself as an Arab who had his family or her family lived in this area for thousands of years. Nothing changed for the same thing. You've been farming the same land forever, and then you see things are changing very quickly. New people come and they take over. And if you think that we here invented the fear of immigration, just think about the way they felt. These people are coming and they're taking over our land. They're buying more and more of our land. They have wealthy Jewish organizations and wealthy Jewish philanthropists who are buying land here. And life is changing. And we may find ourselves out of our land. And where there were the vast majority in 1880, in 39 there were 2/3, but look at 1948, what happened? 82%. Yes, they were. Yes, they were. The Arabs were pushed out, some of them ran out, but were not allowed to come back. Okay, which created many other problems because these are the refugees. I will talk more about it, but since you mentioned it, whenever you read in depth about the negotiations that do not really exist, but when they existed between Israel and the Palestinians, they're all talking about the 1948 refugees. Okay, this is, you see the number, between 1947 and there were 1.3 million Arabs, and it went down to 156,000. Okay, where are these people? Many of them in refugee camps in Jordan, in other places. Gaza, one of the reasons that it's so hot and they hate the Israelis so much is that Gaza is, large part of it is a refugee camp from 1948. Okay, in Lebanon, there are still refugee camps. Okay, so these people had the land, and then, as they have been fearing since the 1880s, or at least 1908, that's why I brought this first anti-Zionist newspaper, who was warning, you know, the Jews are coming, they're going to kick us out of our land. And the Jews said, no, don't worry, we're just here, we're going to be peaceful, we love you, we all learn to live together. Well, maybe they meant it, but this is the reality. That they they're forced to leave their land.
Well, how come there ended up being 156,000 left?
They never left. And they were in places that they never left, and Israel never pushed them out. So after the war, they stayed there, and they lived within the borders of the new state of Israel, and Israel gave them citizenship. Okay, but anyone who left during the war or was pushed out during the war was not allowed to come back. And these are places like in Tel Aviv, where my university was. That was an Arab place, okay? But, and there are all these debates, and you can think whatever you want, but I don't think that Manhattan is going to be an Indian reservation again. Okay, Tel Aviv is not going to be an Arab village. But it's important to know the facts and to understand where some of these hard feelings come from, okay? We're not trying to justify anything, I'm just describing the facts. These are the numbers, okay? And today's particularly, I wanted us to look at it more from the Palestinian or the Arab perspective. And they've been saying all along, the Jews will kick us out, and the Jews did. I don't know if that's necessarily was the intention, and when I'll talk about the war of 1948, I'll describe many different ways to explain it. Okay, they started the war, different other explanation, but the reality, if you just look at the numbers, that's what you see. Any comments or?
How does that differ from the expulsion of Jews from all the Arab/Muslim countries?
So Kenny is asking, how is it different? Almost here. So Kenny is asking how is it different from the expulsion of the Jews from Arab countries after 1948. That's one of the strong arguments of the Israelis and pro-Israelis when the Palestinians say, hey, you kicked us out, And we say, yeah, but the Jews were kicked out of their lands, and that was the time in which there was, you can call it in a nicer name, population exchange, or you can call it any way you want. But yeah, that's a very strong argument for the Israelis, for the pro-Israel. Yeah, we did it right, instead of just hiding it. You know, and recently I see more and more. In the past, we used to deny everything, but yeah, that's the price of war. That's the price of war, and they left, they were pushed out, and we were pushed out too, and that's a reality now. And that was 8 years ago, and move on. The Jews do not have any right of return to any of these Arab countries. I don't think that even if they had the rights, they would have gone back. And, you know, maybe one day we should definitely, the only person from our congregation I know is Leona Holland, who lived in Egypt for generations. And overnight, her family had to escape with nothing. You know, we read these stories about California, how people had to take 2 pictures and were running out of California to save their lives. That's more or less what happened to the Jews in many places. Or if they had a little bit of time, they sold their homes and businesses for a fraction of its value and fled. And Jews cannot go back to Poland. I cannot go to Lodz and find my grandparents' place. You know, it's 8 years ago. But again, it's not, this is not a debate of who is right, who is wrong. This is the history. So it's important for us as supporters of Israel and Zionists just to know. That's the reality. Okay, let's move along. I'll just skip this. This is a nice map. I always like this map. No, that's I think the reward of studying history, because when you do it right and you focus and you understand the present times, especially when you look at the Middle East. Because you cannot understand what's happening in Israel, Palestine, in Syria, in Iraq, anywhere, without understanding the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the British in 1960. You cannot. Okay, and that's what I wanted, or at least I tried to do. Okay, I think we can go to the second page of this. I know I took a lot of time, much more than I expected, but this is, I think, at the foundation of the understanding of the conflict. It's not just the Jews versus the Arabs. It was also the British, it was also the French. Okay, they felt that they were lied to by everyone. They were used and lied to by everyone, and the Jews got something that they did not deserve. Okay, 1919, the Emir Faisal's memorandum. The Emir Faisal, so one of the names that I mentioned and I want to mention again is Chaim Weizmann, right? Very important Zionist leader. It's the Weizmann Institute. Weizmann was a chemist, a very world-renowned scientist. We know of him as a Zionist leader. He met with Faisal, who at that time was the, let's call the representative of the Arabs, all the Arabs, okay? And he wanted to reach an agreement. And he said, you want an independent Arab country. We want our little Jewish state, right? Let's work together. We actually have a lot in common. And if we unify our efforts, both of us may get what we want. Because remember, Faisal, or at least his father Hussein, was promised everything. And Weizmann and him met, and there is a document that you can look online, the Faisal-Weizmann's document or agreement, in which it seems like they agreed. Faisal started this document by talking about the closeness, ethnic and religious closeness of the Arabs and the Jews. You know, we're all the children of Abraham. We all come from the same or a similar geographical area from the Middle East. We have so much in common, and we should collaborate. We should work together. And it seems like, I keep saying it seems like, and I'll tell you in a second why, he agreed for Jewish immigration to Palestine because, yeah, Jews should live there, and the Jews should promise that even when they're the majority in Palestine, they will respect the rights of the Arab minority, etc. And it looks like a really beautiful document. Only that the document, or at least the final version that we have, was written in English, a language that Faisal didn't know. And Weizmann spoke English. Okay, so it seems like Faisal agreed to a little bit more than he had expected. But at least it's a nice document in a way. It's available online in a way that shows that a dialogue between Jews and Arab is possible even during tough times. Probably what Faisal thought was, yes, Jews can come to Palestine, and it was good because many of the Arabs, at least those with business mind, so that's really good because the Jews, for the most part, were Europeans, were much more technologically, economically advanced than the Arabs. They would come here, they would bring investment, they would build factories here. So that's good for everyone to have Palestine as the Silicon Valley of, like Tel Aviv today, right? The Silicon Valley of the Middle East, or people call it, the startup nation. But some of the Arabs at that time did not see the Jews as a threat, but as the future economic force to develop the area. And if Palestine will be developed, that will bleed to all around, okay? Some of the Arab villages in Israel, almost all the Arabs in Israel live not where the Jews live. It's not officially segregated. And there are few mixed cities, but for the most part, almost all the Arabs in Israel, and 20% of 9 million, you can do the math, almost 2 million now, live in Arab villages with almost 100% Arab population. Okay, they're with their own schools, but some of them, those who are close to Israel, are in a much better shape than most Arab cities in the world. Don't look at Dubai, but that's an extreme case, right? But for the most part, because Israel is in a good shape and it influenced the Arabs. So that's probably what Faisal thought, but Faisal assumed that this Jewish state will still be under the control of the large Arab country. Okay, these Jewish enclaves inside of this huge Arab country, which is fine. The Jews can be there. And that's not Weizmann, what Weizmann had in mind. He wanted an independent Jewish state in Palestine that will be called Israel. Okay, not to be a little province of the large Arab state. But it's an important small document from that era of this beautiful dialogue between these two leaders, the leaders of the Arabs and one of the leaders of the Jews, who found some things in common. There started to be violence now in Palestine, mainly violence of the Arabs against the Jews. The first one was a small place, a small one that about 6 Jews were killed. And if you follow me, you see the League of, forget about the League of the Nation, you'll read it later, the establishment of Haganah. Haganah was the paramilitary group that the Jews established in Palestine. Let's call it the Jewish army in Palestine. Now, they couldn't have a real army because who controlled Palestine? The British, right? You cannot have a militia and then say, okay, I will have tanks. You cannot have an army within a country that has an army, okay? But the Jews realized we have to defend ourselves because the Arabs started to be violent and they will continue to be violent, and we have to find a way to protect ourselves. So they established the Haganah, literally means the defense, okay? And the Haganah was founded in 1920, so 28 years later, overnight, will become the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces. Okay, they already established a para-army, or a model of an army. Okay, so the Haganah was the army of the Yeshuv. Yeshuv was the Jewish community in Palestine. And they really needed it. The first serious riot or act of violence was in 1921 in Jaffa. Have you been to Jaffa? It's almost hard to distinguish between Jaffa and Tel Aviv. But Jaffa was the important city. Jaffa has a port. Jaffa is mentioned in the Bible. When the famous Jonah escaped, when God told him, Jonah, go to Nineveh, he went to Jaffa. Okay, this city has been around for thousands of years. No. Haifa is also a port city, but Haifa is in the north. Jaffa is in the center, let's say. It's really by Tel Aviv, and it's one municipality. It's called the Municipality of Tel Aviv, Jaffa. Okay, but the Jews and the Arabs, it was a mixed city, still is a mixed city. Jaffa is one of the only mixed cities in Israel. Jews and Arabs live together. And it's not funny when so many people were killed, but it started almost as a mistake. It started with a fight between two Jewish groups. So it was May 1st. What's happening in May 1st? May Day, right? It's the communist holiday. And Israel started as a socialist country. It was an important day, May 1st, I don't think anymore. In any case, so the communist Jewish group had a demonstration there, unauthorized. Another group of more moderate socialists also had a demonstration there, authorized. And there started fighting. The two Jewish groups, nothing to do with Arabs, okay, in Jaffa. But somehow a rumor, we did not invent fake news. Somebody started fake news. No, all over the history is all about fake news. Not all about, but a lot. That the Jews attack Arabs, even though it was a Jewish fight. So the Arabs from Jaffa came, saw these Jewish people fighting and started to attack them, thinking that they had attacked other Arabs. To make things even more interesting, there was one person, an American architect, Jewish American architect, who lived in Israel and worked for the British mandate. When he saw what was happening, he stole a weapon from the British and gave it to the Jews. And now you had more than just knives and axes. You had weapons, you had pistols. And as you can see, the numbers are, I included the numbers, I assume, right? Yeah, 47 Jews were killed and 48 Arabs. But that was the first time, that's serious violence, right? 100 people got killed and many more were injured. Okay, and many Jews fled Jaffa to Tel Aviv. And you know what's the significance of 1920? That's when Tel Aviv became a city. Because the people of Tel Aviv tried to convince the British. It's very hard to remember all the time that the British controlled everything. It was a British place. And they wanted to become a municipality. And the British said no. But after the riots of Jaffa, the British said, okay, we need a Hebrew, a Jewish big city next to Jaffa, because this mixture of Jews and Arabs doesn't work so well. So that was one big one, and let's move down to 1929, the Hebron or the Hebron massacre. That was big. Hebron is one of the biblical cities. According to the Bible, many of our ancestors are buried in a cave of Machpelah in Hebron. Hebron is mentioned many times in the Bible. A lot of the stories of our ancestors, of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and their families, was around Hebron, okay? And there was a Jewish presence in Hebron forever until that massacre. Mainly a presence of some yeshiva students, okay, some very observant Jews. In 1929, and here I'm going to mention a name of an infamous man, Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Amin al-Husseini, or Hajj Amin al-Husseini, was the leader. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem and de facto the leader of the Arabs of Palestine. Remember this name, because everything bad starts and ends with him. He hated the Jews. He was fighting the Jews to a point in which he collaborated with Adolf Hitler. So there are pictures you can find of Hajj Amin al-Husseini meeting with Hitler, okay? Because the enemy of your enemy is your best buddy, okay? In any case, the Hajj Amin al-Husseini one day started a rumor that the Jews are going to invade the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Rock of the Dome, the third most important place for Muslims in the world, in Jerusalem, just by the Western Wall. The Jews never had an intention, definitely not back then, of storming into that area. That would mean suicide and many other things. They never wanted it. But sometimes all you have to say is the Jews are going there and they are going to destroy our super important mosque, the third in importance. And the riots, it was not even riots, it was a clear massacre, killing 67 Jews in Hebron. They really massacred them. They used knives and axes, and children, women, men, whoever came at night to the houses and slaughtered. That was a bloodbath. That was the first time in millennia that no Jew, at least until 1967, lived in Hebron. Okay, Hebron was clear of Jews. Nobody would dare. Okay, so that shows you the escalation of the violence, mostly of the Arabs against the Jews. But if you remember this chart that I showed you, more and more Jews were coming. More and more Arabs were losing their land, losing their jobs. They were forced out of their land into the cities to be day workers. It was humiliating for them. They lived in awful poverty, and they blamed the Jews for all the bad things that happened to them. They didn't blame the Arab rich landlord who sold the land to the Jews, okay? But they blamed the Jews, and frankly, if I were them, I don't know that I wouldn't have blamed the Jews, because these people come and they kick me out. Life was the same for 1,000 years. I can trace my family into the same land for 1,000 years. And most of them lived in this land, but they never officially owned it because they did not. That was not the thing to do. Everyone knew that's your land. Nobody would come and take your land. But there was no official ownership of a lot of these lands. No official ownership, you're out, we're in, okay? A lot of the same things happen in this country as well. So I'm not telling you things that you don't know from other places. Oh wow, that's late. So Hebron massacre and Jewish immigration is intensifying. The more Hitler became popular, more Jews tried to come to Palestine. Because at that time, America more or less closed its gates to people from Eastern Europe, which meant Jews. Okay? So there was a small quota for Jews, of Jews who were allowed to come to America, and we will see that even a smaller quota of Jews were allowed to go to Israel. You know what? I think I will end here. before the Arab Revolt, because it's a good time to end. So next week, hopefully, we'll get to 1948, and establish the country of Israel. Any questions? Yes, I.
Relationship, you see a big decrease in the Arab population in 48. But I understood almost an equal number of people came to Israel from the Arab countries. That doesn't show up
It was not in,
in 48.
it was more 49-50. Yes, yes, I ended it at 48 because that I was hoping to get there. But yes, you'll see the influx. So the Jewish population in 1948 was around 650, during the independence of Israel at May 14th was about 650, and it grew to 2.5 million in a very short time. Okay, a big chunk of it were Jews from Arab countries who were kicked out. Now I have a question for you. Who is celebrating a birthday today? Happy birthday. So you came to celebrate your birthday with all of us? We don't have a cake, but at least let's end by singing you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Oh, thank you. See you next week. Why don't you take them with you? You want? Either take them, leave them here, if you, whatever you want to do. I will have fresh copies, and hopefully we will finish the pre-state. Why didn't the Arab? I'm sorry, I cannot.
Why didn't the Arabs get mad at the British?
Oh, why didn't they get mad at the British? That's the beginning of next week. That's where I stopped, that the Arab revolt was mainly against the British. Yeah. The Jews were an easier target, but they realized that killing some Jews is not going to change anything. And in 1936, they started the large Arab revolt that lasted for 3 years and was devastating for everyone, especially for the Jews in Europe who couldn't go to Palestine anymore. Without that part, you know, we can only speculate, but hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of Jews could have been saved. But the British closed the gates when we needed them open. But that's next week.